In 2014, one private company in America was worth $9 billion. Its founder was the youngest self-made female billionaire alive, and its product did not work. Welcome to Blind Trust. This is the story of Theranos, but it isn't really a story about a broken machine. It is a story about names, because long before a single drop of blood was tested, the smartest money in the world had already stopped asking the only question that mattered. The pitch was simple, and it was beautiful. One drop of blood from a finger, hundreds of tests, no needle, no vial, no lab. The woman selling it wore a black turtleneck and spoke in a low, certain voice. And when she stood on a stage in 2014, she said this.
We've made it possible to run comprehensive laboratory tests from a tiny sample or a few drops of blood that could be taken from a finger.
And for a while, almost everyone believed her. Secretaries of state believed her. Generals believed her. A pharmacy chain with 8,000 stores believed her and put her machine in front of real sick people. The question is how? How did a college dropout get a former defense secretary to vouch for a device he didn't understand? That is the part nobody really explains. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the moment. It is the early 2010s in Silicon Valley, and the most valuable thing a young founder can own isn't a product. It is a story. The model of the decade was simple. Find a slow, boring, enormous industry. Promise to blow it up with software. Raise money on the promise, grow fast. And worry about whether the thing actually works much, much later. It built Uber. It built Airbnb. For a while, it looked like it could build anything. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford as a sophomore in 2003. She was 19. She said she was afraid of needles, and she picked the most regulated, most scientific industry she could find, blood, and she told it the Silicon Valley story. The lab test is old, slow, and cruel, and I am going to fix it with one drop. Here is the thing about that industry, though. Software, when it is broken, gives you a bad app. A blood test, when it is broken, gives you a number, and a doctor makes a decision with that number. The stakes weren't an app store rating. The stakes were a diagnosis. But none of that mattered yet because the story was working. The money was coming in. And to make the story unstoppable, Holmes was about to do something no software founder had ever needed to do. So let's actually look at the promise, because the promise is where the whole thing lives. Picture a normal blood test. A nurse ties off your arm, finds a vein, and draws a tube. Sometimes several tubes. That blood goes to a central lab where refrigerator-sized machines run it. One type of analysis, per machine. It is a building full of equipment. Now here is Theranos' version. You prick your finger. A few drops fall into a tiny tube the company called a nanotainer, about the size of the tip of your little finger. That one tube goes into a single box, sitting in a store, and that one box runs not one test, but hundreds. Cholesterol, vitamin levels, cancer markers, all from the same drop. They named the box the Edison after the inventor. And if it had worked, it genuinely would have changed medicine. That is the part people forget. The dream was good. A diabetic could test at home. A village with no lab could run blood work off a single device. There was just one problem, and it was the kind of problem you can't talk your way around. A drop of blood from a finger isn't the same as blood from a vein. It is contaminated with fluid from the tissue, and there is barely any of it. To run hundreds of tests, the company had to dilute that tiny sample down, and dilution makes the results less accurate, not more. So the engineers inside Theranos were being asked to beat physics on a deadline. And when you can't beat physics, but the launch date is already set, and the investors are already in, you have two choices. You tell the truth and lose everything, or you find a way to make the box look like it is working. Theranos chose the second one. But to get away with that, you need cover. You need people no one would dare doubt. This is the part of the story I think actually matters most, and it is the part the movies skip. Theranos' greatest invention was never the Edison. It was its board of directors. Read the names out loud. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. George Shultz, former Secretary of State. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. Sam Nunn, who ran the Senate Armed Services Committee. Admiral Gary Roughead. And General James Mattis, fresh from commanding all U.S. forces in the Middle East. Now look at that list again and notice what isn't on it. Not one practicing doctor. Not one lab scientist. Not one expert in blood chemistry. This was a board assembled to run a foreign policy, not to check a medical device. And that was the genius of it. Think about what a name like that does. When an investor sits across from a 30-year-old founder, he is nervous. He is risking real money on an unproven kid. But then he sees Henry Kissinger's name on the board, and a quiet voice in his head says, "These men are not fools. They've seen everything. If something here were wrong, surely they would know." So he stops doing his own homework. He outsources his judgment to the names on the wall. That is the machine. Credibility flows in one direction, from the famous men, down to the founder, and out to the investors. And at no point does anyone stop to ask whether the famous men ever checked. Because here is the secret nobody said out loud. The statesmen didn't understand the technology either. They weren't lying. They were trusting her, exactly the way the investors were trusting them. It was blind trust, stacked all the way up. A tower of people each vouching for a thing none of them had verified. And it was about to be pointed at the one place where being wrong stops, being a financial problem. And the credibility converted directly into cash. Over its life, Theranos raised more than $700 million from investors during the fraud period alone, on the way to that $9 billion valuation. The media tycoon Rupert Murdoch put in around $125 million of his own money. Here is a number that tells the whole story. In 2014, Holmes told investors the company would bring in over $100 million in revenue that year. The real figure, the one in the company's own books, was about $100,000. She was off by a factor of 1,000. Not a typo, 1,000 times. But the board didn't just open wallets, it opened doors that should have stayed shut. General Mattis had been so taken with the device that, while he was still in uniform running Central Command, he pushed to get the Edison tested on the battlefield in Afghanistan, to use it on wounded American soldiers. Think about that. A device whose accuracy was already being questioned inside its own company, headed for a combat medics kit. It didn't get there. A mid-level Army officer, a lieutenant colonel, looked at the regulations and quietly blocked the deployment, because the device had never been cleared. One person, far down the chain, doing the homework that 4-star generals and cabinet secretaries hadn't. He stopped the device from reaching soldiers. But there was a second front. And on that one, no lieutenant colonel was standing in the way, because Theranos had signed a deal with a company that didn't put the Edison anywhere near a battlefield. It put it on a shelf, in a strip mall, in the suburbs. The company was Walgreens, 8,000 stores. In 2013, Theranos and Walgreens opened what they called wellness centers, little blood draw counters inside the pharmacy, right next to where you pick up your prescriptions. You could walk in off the street, give a few drops of blood, and walk out with results. More than 40 of them opened across Arizona and California. And this is the moment the whole thing stops being a Silicon Valley story and becomes something else. Because the people walking into those Walgreens weren't investors who could afford to lose money. They were pregnant women. They were cancer patients tracking their blood. They were ordinary people who trusted that a test sold in a pharmacy had to be real. Now remember the problem from before. The Edison couldn't actually run most of the tests it advertised, so here is what Theranos did. For the vast majority of tests, it quietly took the patient's blood and ran it on ordinary commercial machines, made by Siemens. The exact big lab machines the company had told the world it was replacing. The revolution was secretly using the technology it claimed to have killed, and for the handful of tests that did run on the Edison, the quality checks inside the lab were failing. The machines gave different answers for the same blood. Real patients were getting real results, wildly wrong results, for things like blood clotting and miscarriage risk. A few of them were sent to the emergency room over numbers from a device that didn't work. So sit with the full shape of it. A board of generals and statesmen, $700 million, a $9 billion valuation. And at the very bottom of the tower, where all that blind trust finally touched the ground, was a sick person in a strip mall, holding a piece of paper with a number on it that was simply not true. The question now wasn't whether Theranos would be exposed. It was who inside the company would be the first to say something, knowing exactly who they'd be going up against. Two of the people who said something were barely out of college. Their names were Erica Chung and Tyler Schultz, and they worked in the Theranos lab, watching the quality control numbers fail day after day. Tyler Schultz wasn't just any junior employee. His grandfather was George Schultz, the former Secretary of State, one of the most powerful men on the Theranos board, the very name lending the company its credibility. So when Tyler raised concerns, he wasn't just challenging his boss. He was telling his own grandfather that the company he'd vouched for was a fraud, and his grandfather chose to believe Elizabeth Holmes over him. Listen to how Erica Chung describes what it costs to be the person who refuses to look away.
In my case at Theranos, if I was wrong, I was going to have to pay the consequences. But if I was right, the fact that I could have been a person that knew what was going on and didn't say something, that was purgatory. Being silent.
Theranos came after them hard. Holmes's lawyers were led by David Boies, one of the most prominent litigators in the country whose firm had the resources to make a lawsuit ruinous. The two young employees were followed, threatened with lawsuits, made to feel that going up against the company could end their careers before those careers even started. This is what the credibility machine is for in the end, not just to attract money, but to make doubting it feel impossible. But Tyler and Erica weren't the only ones who'd started asking questions. Somewhere in New York, a reporter had gotten a tip, and unlike a board of statesmen, a reporter's entire job is to refuse to take a famous name as proof. The reporter was John Carreyrou, an investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal. He spent 10 months chasing the story, tracking down former employees, getting the failing lab data, finding the patients with the wrong results. And when Holmes found out the article was coming, she didn't respond by opening the labs and proving the device worked. She tried to kill the story. She went to the very top. She called Rupert Murdoch directly, the man who owned the Wall Street Journal's parent company and had just invested $125 million in Theranos. She asked the owner to stop his own newspaper. Murdoch said no. He let his reporters do their job, and on the 16th of October 2015, the story ran on the front page. The first crack in the glass. Here is how Carreyrou described the heart of what he'd found.
Of going into Walgreens stores and offering the Theranos finger stick tests in Walgreens stores in Palo Alto and in the Phoenix area, because then you cross over into affecting patient health. I mean, these are real patients, real lives that were at stake.
Holmes went on television and called it false. She said the journal was attacking her because she was a young woman changing the world, that this was what happens to every visionary before they're proven right. For a moment, it was her word, and the board's names against one reporter. But facts don't care about turtlenecks or famous boards. Once the first regulators walked into the lab and ran their own inspection, the story stopped being a matter of opinion. And what they wrote in their report used a phrase you almost never see from a government health agency. The phrase was immediate jeopardy. In early 2016, federal lab regulators concluded that the Theranos lab posed an immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. That is the most serious finding they can make. After that, the collapse came fast. The regulators revoked the lab's license and banned Holmes from running a blood testing lab for 2 years. The company was forced to void 2 years of Edison test results, to tell tens of thousands of patients that the numbers they'd been given simply didn't count. Walgreens shut every wellness center and ended the partnership. And the valuation. Forbes had once crowned Holmes the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world, with a personal fortune of $4.5 billion. In 2016, the same magazine revised her net worth to a single number 0, not reduced. 0. The famous board members started to resign and distance themselves. The names that had flowed credibility down into the company now flowed away from it just as fast. And one by one, the men who had lent Elizabeth Holmes their reputations had to answer a question they'd never expected to face. What exactly had they been vouching for? By the time the case reached a federal courtroom in San Jose, the question of whether the device worked was settled. The trial was about something harder. Did Elizabeth Holmes know? Was she a true believer who failed, or did she lie on purpose? And one of the witnesses the prosecution called was General James Mattis, the man who had sat on the board who had pushed to put the Edison in front of American troops. He took the stand under oath, and he was asked what he'd come to understand about the company he'd vouched for. His answer was about as plain as it gets.
You served on its board in retirement. How do you explain what happened there?
You know, Judy, once in a while, we can all be fooled by something. I think that the technology, at least according to the medical people, experts on the board.
3 words from a 4-star general, one of the most respected military minds in America. He was fooled. And if he was fooled, a man whose entire career was built on assessing threats and reading people, then what hope did an ordinary investor have, looking at his name on that board and deciding it was safe? That is the uncomfortable truth underneath this whole story. The credibility machine didn't just fool the public, it fooled the people who were the credibility. The names on the wall trusted her too. The trust went all the way up, and there was no one at the top who had actually checked. On the 3rd of January, 2022, the jury delivered its verdict. Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of defrauding investors. And there is a detail in that verdict that says everything about who the system protects. She was convicted of defrauding the investors, the people with money. But on the charges of defrauding the patients, the pregnant women, the cancer patients, the people in the strip mall, the jury did not convict. Part of that is a quirk of the law. Prosecutors had to prove Holmes knew specific false results were reaching specific patients, and that is a hard thing to prove. But the shape of the outcome is still difficult to sit with. The investors who lost millions got a verdict. The patients who got false numbers did not, and legal scholars are still arguing about what that says. Holmes was sentenced to more than 11 years in federal prison. Her partner and the company's chief operating officer, Sunny Balwani, was convicted on even more counts and sentenced to nearly 13. The court ordered them to pay $452 million in restitution. Here is a reporter outside the courthouse on the day the sentence came down.
Elizabeth Holmes was sentenced today to 11.25 years in prison. This is her punishment for 4 counts of criminal fraud. In January, a jury found her guilty of defrauding investors in Theranos, the blood testing startup that she ran.
And the board, not one of those famous men, was charged with anything. They walked away with their reputations a little scratched and their freedom entirely intact. The founder went to prison. The machine that made it all possible, the names, the trust, the borrowed credibility, never sat in the dock at all. It is easy to watch a story like this and decide it is about one extraordinary liar. A founder with a deep voice and a black turtleneck who fooled everyone. And she did lie. A court has said so. And the lies put sick people at risk. But I don't think that is the real lesson here. Because for every Elizabeth Holmes, you need a room full of serious, careful, powerful people willing to lend their names to something they never checked. The fraud needed the machine. And the machine was built out of our own instinct. The one that says, if someone important already trusts this, I don't have to look too closely myself. That instinct isn't stupid. We can't verify everything ourselves. We have to trust someone. But Theranos is what happens when a whole chain of people each assume that someone above them did the checking, and no one actually did. The trust was real. The thing it was pointed at was empty. So the next time you see a name you respect attached to something, an investment, a product, a promise, it is worth asking the question the whole board forgot to ask. Not, do I trust the name? But has anyone here, even once, actually checked? Because somewhere right now, there is another $9 billion story being built on the answer.